There's a very strange moment you've probably experienced. You're thinking about something, and then suddenly you realize you're thinking about the fact that you're thinking, and within seconds, everything starts to spiral deeper. A message you sent this morning, a look someone gave you in a meeting, a sentence that seemed completely ordinary, all of it comes back, clearer, bigger, and harder to control. You tell yourself, I'm just analyzing it. But if it really is analysis, why do you feel so exhausted? Most people believe that overthinking is simply worrying more than others, a bad habit, like biting your nails or losing sleep. But the truth is, that view is far too superficial, because what's happening in your mind isn't a flaw, it's a system operating in overdrive. And this is what truly matters. You're not stuck because you think too much. You're stuck because you're thinking in a way that never leads you to a resolution. You replay conversations. You analyze every detail. You construct dozens of what-if scenarios, not because you're weak, but because a part of you believes that if you think long enough, you'll find the answer that makes everything feel right. But what you don't realize is, you're not moving forward. You're just running in circles. And in this video, we're going to do something very different. Not how to stop thinking, because that's almost impossible, but to understand exactly what's happening inside your mind, so you can take back control. Because once you see the mechanism behind it, you'll realize something very important. Maybe you were never overthinking. You were simply never taught how to get out of it. The problem starts here. You believe you're thinking in order to find a solution. But if you look more closely, you'll notice something very different. You're not actually getting closer to an answer. You're just returning to the same point from different angles. You replay that conversation the first time to understand what happened, the second time to see if you were wrong, the third time to imagine how things would have turned out if you had said something different, then the fourth, the fifth, until you're no longer sure what's real and what you've imagined. That's not effective thinking. That's a loop. And this is where most people misunderstand. Overthinking is not thinking too much. It's thinking without getting anywhere. There's a very clear difference between these two states. When you're actually solving a problem, your thinking has direction. It starts with a specific question, moves through a process, and ends with a decision, whether that decision is perfect or not. You feel progress, clarity, a sense of, okay, I've handled this to some extent. But when you're overthinking, there is no endpoint. You're not looking for an answer. You're looking for absolute certainty. And that's the trap, because in real life, there is no such thing as absolute certainty. But your brain, especially when it's anxious, refuses to accept that. It wants to make sure you won't make a mistake, won't be judged, won't get hurt. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It keeps thinking, and thinking, and thinking. But the irony is, the more you think, the worse you feel. You begin to doubt yourself. You start seeing things more negatively. You begin to notice problems that didn't even exist before. And at some point, you're no longer analyzing the situation. You're being controlled by your own thoughts. This is why, after thinking so much, you don't feel relieved. You feel exhausted instead, as if you've run a long distance, yet stayed exactly where you are. And if you recognize yourself in this, there's a truth you need to hear, even if it's a bit hard to accept. You're not stuck because the problem is too complex. You're stuck because the way you're trying to solve it will never lead to a result. But that doesn't mean you're weak. In fact, it's often a sign of a mind that is highly sensitive, highly observant, and deeply concerned with getting it right. It's just that it has learned the wrong way to keep you safe. And to truly understand that, we need to go a bit deeper into how your brain actually works, and why it refuses to switch off precisely when you need it to stop the most. Inside your brain, there are two main modes of operation. One mode helps you focus on the outside world when you're working, talking, making decisions. And another mode becomes active when you're not focused on anything specific, when you're sitting still, when you're about to fall asleep, when you let your mind wander. It's this second mode where everything begins. There, your brain starts doing what it believes is useful, replaying the past to learn from it, imagining the future to avoid risks, reviewing social signals to make sure you didn't do anything wrong. In essence, this is an incredibly intelligent system. It helps you learn faster, adapt better, and avoid mistakes. But the problem arises when that system doesn't know how to stop. Instead of just doing a quick check and moving on, it starts digging deeper. One thought leads to another. One assumption pulls in another. And very quickly, you're no longer in reality. You're inside a version of reality created by your own mind. The most dangerous part is this. Your brain doesn't clearly distinguish between what is actually happening and what you're imagining. When you think about a negative situation, your body reacts as if it's really happening. Your heart rate increases, tension rises, stress hormones are activated, and immediately, your brain receives a signal. There's danger. Keep analyzing. And that's when the loop begins. You think you worry. Your body reacts. Your brain interprets it as danger. You think even more. And the deeper you go into that loop, another part of your brain, the part responsible for clear, logical decision-making, starts to weaken. Not because it disappears, but because it's being overpowered. That's why you can still know you're overthinking. But you can't stop. Not because you lack discipline, not because you're weak, but because in that moment, your emotional system is speaking louder than your rational system. And there's one more thing very few people realize. Overthinking isn't always negative. In fact, it often shows up most strongly in people who are highly observant, sensitive to their environment, and especially deeply attentive to others. You pick up on tones in people's voices. You notice subtle changes in behavior. You sense when something is off, even when no one says a word. The problem is, when all of those signals enter your mind, they don't just stop at noticing. Your mind begins to analyze. It tries to decode. It searches for meaning. And when there's no clear answer, it creates one. That's when overthinking stops being a tool and becomes a trap. You're no longer using your thoughts. Your thoughts start using you. And if you've ever felt like you couldn't escape your own mind, that's not your imagination. It's a real mechanism. But the good news is, once you understand this mechanism, you'll start to see something clearly. The problem isn't that you think too much. It's why you feel the need to think this way in the first place. And that's where we're going next. If you look back closely, you'll realize something you may have never considered before. You weren't always like this. You didn't always analyze everything. You didn't always read too deeply into someone's eyes, their tone of voice, or the small details that others don't even notice. But at some point, you started doing it, and gradually, it became a reflex. Not because you wanted to, but because you learned it. Many people who tend to overthink grow up in environments where clarity doesn't exist. No one says exactly what they mean. Emotions shift unpredictably. You never know if today will be okay, or if something is about to happen. And in that kind of environment, your brain does the only thing it can to protect you. It starts observing more. It starts predicting. It starts reading between the lines. You learn to notice the smallest changes. A sigh, a glance, an unusual silence. Because sometimes, that's the only signal that something is about to happen. And when you guess correctly, you feel a little safer. So your brain remembers that. It learns, if I think ahead, I'll get hurt less. And from that point on, thinking is no longer just thinking. It becomes a protective mechanism. The problem is, you're still using that mechanism in situations where you no longer need it. You're no longer in that old environment. You no longer have to read the room just to survive. You no longer have to predict how others will react in order to protect yourself. But your brain doesn't know that. It keeps operating as if you're still in the same situation. That's why you can sit in a completely normal conversation, and yet inside your head, you're analyzing every word, every expression, every pause. Not because you want to, but because a part of you is still trying to keep you safe. And the irony is, the very thing that once helped you adapt, that once helped you avoid pain, has now become the thing that exhausts you. You're no longer just aware. You become overwhelmed. You're no longer just understanding. You begin to doubt. And you're no longer just observing. You begin to lose your own sense of peace. But there is something you need to understand very clearly before we go any further. This does not make you weak. In fact, it says the opposite. It shows that you have the ability to feel deeply, to connect, to see what others overlook. It's just that you haven't learned how to turn it off when it's no longer necessary. And when you can't turn it off, it keeps running. even when there's no reason for it to. That's when overthinking stops being a skill. It becomes a default state. But once you begin to see where it comes from, you'll also start to realize something very important. You're not stuck because this is who you are. You're simply operating on an old program in a life that has already changed. And that means it can change too, just not in the way you think. But there is a kind of overthinking that, if you've ever experienced it, you know how exhausting it can be. It's not about work, not about the future, but about other people, how they see you, what they think about you, how they feel about you. And what makes it dangerous is not that it's negative, but that it's so hard to recognize. You don't think you're overthinking. You think you're being considerate, being thoughtful, trying not to hurt anyone. You reread your messages before sending them, not once, but many times. You adjust every word, every piece of punctuation. You wonder if this sentence sounds too cold, if that one might be misunderstood, whether you should add an "I'm sorry," or if that would make you seem weak. And then, after all that, you send a message that is almost identical to the original version, but you don't stop there. You keep rereading it after it's been sent, trying to guess how the other person will feel when they read it, how they'll respond, whether there's something you missed. And if they reply slower than usual, the loop begins again. You don't just see the delay as a delay, you start assigning meaning to it. You wonder if they're annoyed, if you said something wrong, if they're thinking badly of you, and very quickly, a tiny detail turns into a full story in your head. The important thing is, all of this doesn't come from weakness. On the contrary, it comes from a very high level of sensitivity. You notice subtle changes in behavior, in tone, in how people respond, and you want to make sure you don't do anything that could make things worse. But the problem is, you're trying to control things you cannot control: how others think, how they feel, how they interpret your words. And the more you try to control it, the more you lose control of yourself. You spend so much energy making sure others feel okay, but you don't give yourself that same level of care. You can spend tens of minutes convincing a friend that they are not a burden, that they deserve to be loved, that they don't need to be perfect to be accepted. But when it comes to yourself, you don't believe those same things. The same mind, the same logic, but two completely different standards. And that is where overthinking becomes most dangerous. Not when you think too much, but when you begin using your thoughts against yourself. You're no longer just analyzing the situation. You start analyzing yourself, doubting yourself, constantly editing yourself in your head before you even get the chance to live it. And if you look closely, you'll see something very clear. You're not truly afraid of making mistakes. You're afraid that those mistakes will cause you to be seen in a certain way. You're not afraid of saying the wrong thing, you're afraid of being misunderstood. And so, you try to control everything before it even happens. But the paradox is that very effort strips away your naturalness, your ease, and eventually, it takes you away from yourself in the process of trying to become the right version in other people's eyes. And when you live in that state long enough, you start to feel like you never truly get to rest. Because even when you're alone, the conversation in your head continues, still analyzing, still evaluating, still editing. And that's when you realize the problem is no longer about other people. It's about the fact that your own thoughts have become a place you can't escape. And then there comes a point when you begin to realize something very strange. The problem was never truly in what's happening outside, but in how you're responding to it inside. Not because life is too complicated, not because people are too hard to understand, but because you've become used to trying to solve everything with thought, even the things that cannot be solved by thinking. You try to understand others to feel safe. You try to analyze every possibility to avoid mistakes. You try to control every outcome so you won't get hurt. But the more you try, the further you drift from the sense of peace you're searching for. And here's a truth that not many people tell you. You will never think enough to feel secure. You can only stop to begin feeling at peace. Because peace doesn't come from finding all the answers. It comes from accepting that not every question needs an answer. There are things you will never know about what others think. There are situations you will never be able to control. And there are moments that you can only live through. You cannot perfectly analyze them before they happen. And when you begin to accept that, something small but incredibly important starts to shift. You stop trying to silence your thoughts. You begin to choose, not to follow them. You still have thoughts, but you are no longer carried away by every thought that appears in your mind. You begin to realize, just because a thought appears, doesn't mean it's true. Just because you feel anxious, doesn't mean there's danger. And just because you're uncertain, doesn't mean you're wrong. That is the moment you take back control. Not by forcing your mind into complete silence, because that's almost impossible, but by changing your relationship with what's happening inside your head. And maybe, after all, the goal was never to become someone who doesn't overthink, but to become someone who, no matter how much they think, can still live gently with themselves. Because in the end, freedom is not the absence of thoughts, it's that you are no longer trapped inside them.